After becoming Prime Minister in 1997, Tony Blair became increasingly associated with military interventions, notably in Afghanistan and Iraq. This brought his use of apocalyptic language to the fore both in his speeches and in the media. By the time he became Prime Minister, Blair had occasionally spoken on his Christian beliefs and had developed his thinking about the relationship between religion and politics. Behind the sound bites, Blair believed that religion in its purest form supported ideas of a secular government, liberty, equality, and other values associated with liberal democracy. For Blair, scriptures pointed to this purer, democratic and tolerant origins of a religion behind later illiberal corruptions. Where illiberal sentiments appear present in scriptures, they were to be countered by prioritizing of other parts of scriptures and modified and updated in line with contemporary progressive values held by the community. Thus, Blair argued that Islam started out inspired by the Qur'an as progressive, morally upright, rational and enlightened, but which has too often declined, so he claimed, into dictatorship and support for acts of extremist violence, such as those carried out on September 11th, 2001. Blair's approach to religion and scriptures served as a justification for the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the accompanying war on terror against terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and their sympathizers. Blair's apocalyptic language involved ideas of the dramatic transformation of different parts of the world in line with his idealized understandings of democracy and religion. Certainly, Blair had long seen Christianity in binaries such as right and wrong, good and bad, and he had seen previous interventions abroad in apocalyptic terms. As his agent and friend John Burton put it, Blair believed strongly, although he couldn't say it at the time, that intervention in Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq too, was all part of the Christian battle. Good should triumph over evil. But when it came to the war on terror, Blair was more open in making such statements. In his statement following the September 11th attacks, Blair claimed that this is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We will not rest until this evil is driven from our world. It was Blair's major speeches designed to attract party and parliamentary support for the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions that included his most sustained use of apocalyptic language. In his successful attempt to win over the 2001 Labour Party conference for the invasion of Afghanistan, Blair spoke in terms echoing biblical or biblical style and apocalyptic language, with reference to, for instance, an act of evil. We were with you at the first. We will stay with you to the last. The shadow of this evil, lasting good, hope amongst all nations, a new beginning, justice and prosperity for the poor and dispossessed, the starving, the wretched, the dispossessed, the ignorant, those living in want and squalor. A fuller quotation shows how such language was employed as part of Blair's liberal interventionism and justification for the transformation of what he saw as the most impoverished countries, including Muslim-majority ones. In retrospect, the millennium marked only a moment in time. It was the events of September 11th that marked a turning point in history, where we confront the dangers of the future and assess the choices facing humankind. It was a tragedy, an act of evil. We were with you at the first. We will stay with you to the last. It is that out of the shadow of this evil should emerge lasting good, destruction of the machinery of terrorism wherever it is found, hope amongst all nations of a new beginning where we seek to resolve differences in a calm and ordered way, greater understanding between nations and between faiths, and above all justice and prosperity for the poor and dispossessed, so that people everywhere can see the chance of a better future through the hard work and creative power of the free citizen, not the violence and savagery of the fanatic. I know that here in Britain people are anxious, even a little frightened. I understand that. Don't kill innocent people. We are not the ones who waged war on the innocent. We seek the guilty. Today the threat is chaos. The starving, the wretched, the dispossessed, the ignorant, those living in want and squalor from the deserts of northern Africa to the slums of Gaza, to the mountain ranges of Afghanistan. They too are our cause. This is a moment to seize. The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. Soon they will settle again. Before they do, let us reorder this world around us. In addition to Blair's Christian background, there are numerous possible influences on his use of such language. Some of these influences may have come from American political discourse, such as popular ideas about a clash of civilizations and the apocalyptic evangelicalism associated with Bush. Probably the most direct influences come from apocalyptic language in English political discourse. Journalists typically missed the important allusions in Blair's speech, partly because it was aimed at an insider audience knowledgeable about the Labour Party and its place in British political history. First, the Beveridge Report commissioned during the Second World War challenged the evil giants of want, squalor, disease, and ignorance. This challenge was taken up in the Labour Party Manifesto of 1945, which would form the basis of the most celebrated government in Labour myth-making, particularly with reference to the creation of the National Health Service and development of the welfare state. Written in the aftermath of the Second World War, the manifesto also railed against Japanese barbarism and Nazi tyranny and aggression, claiming victory in war must be followed by a prosperous peace, and, in a line that Blair would echo in his call for international support for the war on terror, that we should build a new United Nations, allies in a new war on hunger, ignorance and want. Order and chaos, words likewise favoured by Blair, were also part of the 1945 manifesto, which stated, "The Labour Party stands for order as against the chaos which would follow the end of all public control. We stand for order, for positive constructive progress as against the chaos." This idea of building a new Jerusalem on the rubble of war and/or deprivation has a long socialist history in Britain, including in the Labour Party generally and the Labour government of 1945 specifically. It is language still invoked. The singing of Jerusalem from William Blake's poem Milton has been a fixture of post-war Labour conferences and contains the famous line, "Till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." Given the sensitivities surrounding Israel and Palestine, it is no surprise that Blair avoided the language of Jerusalem in his speeches. But the allusion to the widely appreciated apocalyptic language of dramatic social transformation for the victims of want, squalor, disease, and a new life for the poor, oppressed, dispossessed, ignorant and wretched of the earth, was language that could be used to convince his ambivalent party to support the invasion of Afghanistan with the assumption that it would be one country among many that would experience the transformation Britain once had in the aftermath of war. Implicit in Blair's speech was also a central national story which resonated far beyond the Labour Party, namely the Second World War. In his speech to Parliament on the eve of the Iraq War in 2003, and thus to an audience across the main political parties, Blair softened his allusions to the 1945 manifesto, but made clear his allusions to the Second World War and the figure of Winston Churchill. While he was aware of the difficulties of making analogies between the 1930s and the present, Blair nevertheless argued that lessons could be learned. It is that with history we know what happened. We can look back and say, there's the time, that was the moment, that's when we should have acted. Blair fused this favoured piece of national history to update the apocalyptic language from the Labour tradition. This recontextualisation allowed Blair to smooth over the problems of historical analogies. At the crucial point in his argument, Blair returned to the language of chaos and order to narrow down his precise targets. The threat today is not that of the 1930s. The world is ever more interdependent. The key today is stability and order. The threat is chaos and disorder. And there are two begetters of chaos, tyrannical regimes with weapons of mass destruction and extreme terrorist groups who profess a perverted and false view of Islam. Blair's speech played an important role in convincing Parliament to support the war in Iraq, and it had a significant influence on mainstream parliamentary political discourse, where the often fantastical language of tyranny, evil, and a monstrous perversion of Islam has been employed by leading politicians to justify military intervention abroad and explain acts of terror while rhetorically avoiding implications that foreign policy or material conditions have played a role in religious violence.